You're tuned in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, guiding your gridiron journey, none other than your host, former NFL lineman, Ross Tucker.
Oh, yeah, it is. But it's not just any Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It is a Monster Monday, but a little bit different. Actually, a Christmas Monday edition of the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It's got a little bit of a different format today. Told you about it last week. Long form interview with my guy, Gary Myers. I think you're going to really enjoy it. We'll recap all the games tomorrow's show on Tuesday and then Power Rankings on Wednesday this week. Shout out goes out to Becca Schaefer, patron of the day, patreon.com/RT Media. It's Big Show time.
The Big Show.
As promised, so excited to be joined by my buddy. Don't get a chance to see him every week during the season like I did for, 5 or 6 years when we worked together on This Week in Football on the Yes Network. He's a pretty awesome pro football writer. In fact, in terms of books, I don't know anyone that's written more books about the NFL, better books about the NFL, Brady and Manning and The Catch. And he's got a new one, which I wanted to dive into, especially this time of year. And then also need to talk to him because he's a Hall of Fame voter. So doubling down on my buddy, Gary Myers, longtime NFL writer, who I guess is it fair to say, Gary, these days you focus on your books, right?
I do. And this was my 6th book. I just want to tell everybody how proud I am of you, because when we worked together at the Yes Network, you were just really starting out as a media member. And, as a writer, we always are skeptical about, these guys think they can just step in and do what we've been trained to do our whole careers. But you were great on that show. And I used to always tease you about your career, and you were so good-natured about it. You stuck around for a long time for a guy for Princeton, and now to parlay it into just a really high-profile, great media career. Like I said, I'm really proud of you.
Wow. Thank you, Gary. That means a lot. Thank you so much for saying that. And congratulations on your latest book. I just got my copy, Once a Giant. And I don't know why, Gary, and my wife knows this, I don't watch a lot of television. I really don't. And by the way, Gary, when I say that, I like to say it like this. I don't watch much television as a Princeton grad. You know what I mean? Like I have no issue with TV. I just don't happen to watch a lot. But when I do, I like to watch like America's Team or America's Game, 30 for 30s, documentaries, missing rings, stuff like that. And stuff like Once a Giant, right? Where I don't want to take the words out of your mouth, but, where you really did a deep dive into that team and that team that year and kind of where they are now, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really more about life after football. And you know what that's like, how brutal a sport it is. And I didn't want to write a book about the 86 season because that was done so many times right after they won that Super Bowl. But 37 years later, what challenges did these guys face as a result of playing in such a physical, brutal sport? The mental health challenges, financial challenges in some cases, physical challenges in most cases. And Ross, there were 4 players on the record in the book who have told me that at some point since their career's over, they considered suicide, that things had gotten so bad. Fortunately, they were able to come out the other side of it. And, rather than having 300 pages of depressing stories, I kind of bounced it off with how this team really became a brotherhood, winning a championship together. If you remember, those were the days before free agency. So 84 and 85, they were building towards the moment in 86 and really went into that season thinking they were going to win it. And I tell a lot of behind the scenes stories about the fun that they had with each other and the practical jokes they played, which is so necessary during the course of a season to keep things, light in the locker room. Otherwise, it can really drag you down. So one of the really cool parts of the book is about how these guys, all these years later, almost 4 decades later, have really stayed in touch and are taking care of each other as they grow old together.
It's interesting, Gary. So I'm 44. And I haven't played, I retired in 2008, but you hear these stories about guys like what you said but a lot of times the players I'm around, because they're out in the public or they're doing something, I don't see a lot of those guys or talk to those guys that are having issues like that. But I know they're out there and I hear that they're out there. But I've also been told a lot of times they don't really want to talk about it. You know, these are guys that their whole life people have treated them special and they were stars in high school and stars in college and they played in the NFL. And sort of the last thing they want to do now is tell people how bad things are or how bad things have gotten or why life's been such a struggle post football. How did you get these guys to open up?
One of the things that I always prided myself on in over 40 years of covering the NFL is developing relationships and developing trust. And the interesting thing to me, I covered the Giants way back, uh, 78 to 81. And then I moved to Dallas from 81 to 89. So I wasn't even here in 86, but I knew a lot of the players that won that championship, like Sims and Taylor and Carson and George Martin and Jim Burt, because they were Giants before I moved away. And then when I moved back, a good deal of them was still here. And so I started being around them, on a more of an everyday basis. I came back to New York in 89 as the NFL columnist for the Daily News. So I kind of split my time between the Giants and the Jets and covering the league. But I always felt like the most important thing was to develop trust with the players and that they know if they said something to you off the record that you weren't going to write it under any circumstances. And if it was a sensitive topic and they were relying on you to write it sensitively, that you didn't disappoint them. So when it came time for me to talk to them about these issues that they're having as they're in their late 50s and late 60s and they're growing old together as a team, I felt I went in there kind of with a running start, so to speak, because I knew these guys and they knew they can trust me. And as I sat in Mark Bavaro's living room and he told me how he suffered through long-term COVID to the point that he sat in his living room chair and was, for a long time, he wondered how guys that he played with, like Dave Duerson and Andre Waters, and somebody he became friendly with, like Junior Seau, how things could reach the level of despair that they would take their own lives. And, how could it be that bad that you would want to end it? And so after about 6 months of going through this long-term COVID, which he thinks the virus might have attacked his brain because his brain was vulnerable from all the concussions that he suffered, and he became paranoid and anxious and afraid to go out in public, and he couldn't sleep at night. He's sitting in this chair in the living room telling me the story, and he was saying about 5 months earlier, he was sitting in the same chair saying, I finally understand why Dave Duerson, who we played with at Notre Dame and with the Giants, and Andre Waters, who we played with in Philadelphia, how they reached that point in their lives where they just ended it. And each one of them subsequently was diagnosed with CTE. And Ross, in a very compelling way, he said it was his intellectual side saying, Mark, you'll be okay. You just got to fight through this. You just got to find the right meds and the right doctors, and this will pass. Versus his emotional side that was saying, for how long can you stand on the side of a mountain and not jump? And it was a battle he was fighting in his brain. He said his brain was literally on fire from COVID. And finally, through some help with the people at the Giants, he found the right doctors in Boston. He lives outside of Boston and was able to get on the right meds. And I don't think he's back to being 100%. This happened around Easter of 2021 when he first got sick. So it's now, 2.5 years later. I don't think he's 100%, but he's getting close to that. And I stayed in touch with him even after the book came out, just checking up on him to make sure he's okay.
So, Gary, I guess, and maybe this is selfishly from my perspective, but if you had to break it down, how many of the guys would you say are really doing well and still thriving? And how many of them are struggling and how many of them are somewhere in between? And I know they're all individuals and it doesn't necessarily relate to how other people I know or how I would be, but I guess I'm just curious because
Yeah.
I think when they're players, you think of all of them as doing great. And then we hear these stories and some of these statistics and numbers of that not being the case. What did you kind of find, the like off the napkin, so to speak, in terms of the breakdown of Giants? You'd say, man, he's really thriving, doing great, as opposed to guys that are struggling, and then guys in between.
Well, everybody's got something, Ross. Nobody gets out of this game unscathed. I'm sure, you have aches and pains to this day, for as long as you played. There were some guys who were doing much better than others, obviously, depending on the degree of where they are physically and financially. Guys like Carl Banks have had, uh, he's a very, very successful businessman, but, he's had back pains. Phil Simms, uh, he's been on national television for 30 straight years, basically from the day that he retired. And he had such a tremendous back pain 5 years ago that actually it was 2015, so a little more than 5 years ago. He went to a Giant preseason game specifically to meet with the team doctor who was there during his playing career. And he had had 3 back surgeries, and he felt completely incapacitated. He was in pain. He wasn't, he was looking ahead at the upcoming season, covering games for CBS, and didn't know how he was going to get through it. And the doctor said, okay, you got to come into my office in the city and really do a good workup on you. And Phil said, I just don't have the time to do that. Phil left before that preseason game was over, Ross. And I mean, before it even started, because he just went to see the doctor, drove home 20 minutes to his house in New Jersey. Now, remember, Phil's father was an alcoholic, and he's always been very cognizant of that. And he's nothing more than a social drinker. But he was in such pain and feeling so despondent that there was no answer for his back problems that he went home, took a bottle of vodka from his liquor cabinet, poured 2 glasses straight, and was taking pain pills with it, which we know is not a good combination. And his pain was so severe that he didn't get any relief from the alcohol or the painkillers. And finally, he talked to his son, Chris, that night, who, when he was in Denver, had found a doctor. The best way I can describe it is like a pain management expert of sorts, a muscle activation guy. Phil went to San Diego that weekend to cover a game and stopped in Denver on the way back for about 4 days. And he said when he got there and the doctor put his hand on Phil's wrist, he couldn't resist the weight. And by the time he left there 4 days later, he said he could have put a truck on his arm and he would have been able to hold it up. And he said, and this was sticks with me, he said, that guy saved my life because he didn't know how he was going to be able to live with all that pain. Now, I'm not saying Phil is not one of the 4 guys who contemplated taking his life, but he walked out of MetLife Stadium that night after meeting with the doctor, and he said, damn it, am I going to be one of those guys that just has to live with this pain the rest of my life? And how am I going to deal with it? So that's an example of a guy that outwardly you never would have known how much he was suffering. But after 3 back surgeries, it hadn't done anything for him to the point he was drinking straight alcohol with painkillers. So that's kind of an extreme case, but I interviewed players who had Maurice Carthon had a stroke. William Roberts had a brain tumor that fortunately wasn't malignant. Other players have had body parts replaced. Carl Banks teases Brad Benson, an old offensive lineman. He calls him Mr. Potato Head. Didn't have any surgeries during his career, but after his career has had surgeries on basically every body part and, some replacements. So,
Wow.
from that,
That
from that era, Ross, I just want to say one other thing. From that era when guys suffered concussions, and maybe you went through some of this, but I think it was a little better by the time you played. If they suffered a concussion, they called them to the sideline, and the trainer would say, what's your name? What stadium are you in? And what day of the week is it? And if you answered those questions correctly, they put you right back in the game.
Yeah.
And now you don't see that player for 3 weeks. So it's changed.
Yeah. I want to ask you about Belichick as well,
Yeah.
Gary. I did want to say first, though, that love drinking Labatt Blue Lights with my friends, my family, living life to the power of we. Always enjoy it responsibly. Of course, beer Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. So Belichick's been in the news recently, Gary, and
Yeah.
there was a report recently that Robert Kraft is going to move on from him. It's kind of stunning to think that we got here. And you've been around him a lot over the
Yeah.
years, and I know you interviewed him for this book. Just sort of your thoughts on kind of what's happened there and what's next for him.
It is amazing considering the guy won 6 Super Bowls, and now we're talking about what the exit strategy is going to be for both of them. And he's under contract past this year, so Robert Kraft is too smart a businessman to fire him and get nothing in return. You got to give up a first-round pick to get him from the Jets. He's going to want a first-round pick to let him go coach somewhere else. I think they've reached that point, that period of time where I think it's mutually beneficial for them to go their separate ways. Bill wants to break Schuler's record. He needs 16 more victories to do it. Who knows how long that will take in New England with the state of that team, which is why I think the Chargers make the most sense. The other component of this is that, Bill has always been, a team oriented guy. Don't think about individual recognition or achievements. It's always about the team. But he's 71 or 72 years old now, and he's so close to that record. So who could blame him for not wanting to be remembered as the all-time winningest coach? And Ross, the other factor here is it was always like the Brady Belichick argument for 20 years, and we can make a case for either one of them of who is more responsible. But considering what's happened in the 4 years since Brady left New England, him winning a championship in his first year in Tampa, and Belichick, things getting worse each of these years, that the narrative is switched that it was more Brady than Belichick. And I think the only way he reverses that and changes his legacy somewhat is by winning a championship without Brady. And I think the Chargers would give him the best opportunity of all the jobs that you would consider right now to be open after the season, because they have a built-in situation with Justin Herbert. They have some good defensive players. They need some tinkering here and there, and I think they can compete for a championship in 2 years, which would give him a chance to break the record and win a Super Bowl. So I think that's the ideal situation, in addition to the Chargers needing to really make an impact in that community where they're clearly the second team to the Rams.
It's a really good point, Gary. You also are a Hall of Fame voter, which is awesome. And you have been for how many years now?
About 12 years now. I really do enjoy that.
Okay. Tell me, I'm going to give you an open-ended question. Tell me one thing, or tell my audience one thing about being a Hall of Fame voter that they don't really understand or that they wouldn't know or wouldn't realize when they're saying, how is this guy not in? How is this guy not in? This guy should be in, et cetera.
Well, we have 50 voters on the panel, so anybody's individual agenda doesn't really carry the day, because you need to get a lot of votes to get in. I think it's a very thorough process up to the point that we voted down to, we're at the point now where we got the list of 25 semifinalists, and I think Monday or Tuesday is the deadline to vote it down to 15. So up to the point of 15, we're pretty much on our own. We'll get a lot of information from the Hall of Fame, and then from other people advocating for any of the candidates. So we have a lot of material to read. I do a lot of the research myself. Once we get it to 15, we're going to meet in Atlanta in the middle of January to pick the seniors and the contributor, and then the 5 modern era candidates. At that point, we make presentations in front of the entire group. I know I take this responsibility incredibly seriously, because they always tell us at the beginning of the meeting, we're going to change lives. And until you experience that by being around these players and you see how much it means to them, you don't really understand the impact it has to be recognized. There's only like 360 people in the Hall of Fame, and probably like 325 players, something like that, and the rest, coaches, owners, etc. So out of the 20,000 or so players who have played in the NFL, to think you're in the elite category of 325 or so, that's an amazing accomplishment. Ross, I've been pushing for you the last few years. I've been doing my damnedest. I think I'm getting some traction going here. I've really been saying, look how many different teams he played for. He obviously was in demand. He's a smart guy, went to Princeton. What's not to like?
Hey,
Maybe
Gary,
in a few
if
years.
I wasn't good, would 5 teams have signed me? Or would five
That's what I
teams
just
have
said.
acquired me? You know what I mean? Like people never look at it that way. They always
No,
talk about the guy that plays 20 years for one team and goes to all these Pro Bowls. What about someone like me that had all these teams that even after I got fired, they still thought I was good enough to give another chance to?
Ross, you were a trendsetter because you went on to prove that maybe it's beneficial to play for all these different coaches. Because one day I know you're going to write a book one day, and you could talk about your experiences in New England and in Buffalo, Dallas, and I forget who else you played for, but I think that'll be a
Washington and
fascinating book.
Cleveland.
Washington, okay,
Yeah, you got a couple good ones for sure. So,
yeah, yeah.
so what's interesting to me about that, about the Hall of Fame more recently, is it seems clear, Gary, that at certain positions and with certain guys, that you are now, I don't know the best way to phrase this, but that there's like you're making certain guys wait or you're rewarding certain guys for waiting. In other words, you might think, okay, player X might have a little bit of a better case than player Y, but player Y has been a finalist for 9 years, and player X, this is his first year, and he's great, but he's not necessarily a first ballot guy. It feels like from afar that might be going on, and I don't know. I don't have necessarily have a problem with it. I just think that it feels like that's going on.
Russ, I can tell you in all honesty that I vote for the 5 players who I think are most deserving, regardless of how long they've been waiting. And I'd like to think that should be really the standard that we live by, because what difference does it make how long you've been waiting um, if you're not as good as somebody else that you're going up against? And I mean, the shame of it is a lot of good players go through the 20 years of modern era eligibility, and then they get stuck in the senior pool, which is very, very hard to get out of because then you're competing against every player who's ever played who's not in the Hall of Fame. And there are, there's some guys in that pool that you look at and you go, how'd they get that far? Why aren't they already in the Hall of Fame? Um, we do make a big deal about first ballot Hall of Famers, and there's a lot of discussion in the room when a guy comes up. And, I'll just mention, somebody like Brian Urlacher, who got in on the first ballot a few years ago, that I thought eventually he was a Hall of Fame player. I didn't know that he was good enough, strictly based on being good enough, to jump over some guys who had been waiting, because whether they were in the first year of eligibility, the fifth together, I thought some of those other guys were more deserving than Urlacher. It really didn't have to do with him being his first year. It's just I thought other guys deserved it. And there's been other guys like that. And off the top of my head, maybe Jason Taylor's another one. And I don't mean to pick these guys out as not being Hall of Fame worthy, but I think they jumped the line a little bit. And not because other guys have been waiting. Again, it's because I thought the other guys were more deserving. And this year we have 2 first-year players, first-time eligibles in Antonio Gates and Julius Peppers. And I think going in, you'd say they each have a really good chance of making it on the first ballot. I don't know what your feelings are about those guys, but if they didn't make it the first time around, I wouldn't be
Yeah,
screaming and yelling
they
about
are
it.
absolutely both fantastic
Mhm.
players. I wouldn't have a problem with either one of them. I will say this, I won't have a problem with every one of you guys listening or watching gets Once a Giant, a story of victory, tragedy, and life after football. I haven't dove into it yet, Gary, but I can't wait. Spring and especially summer is my book reading season. Thank you so much for coming on the show, man. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate it, Ross. Amazon, all your favorite stores, and you being a Princeton grad and all these plane flights you're taking, I'm really disappointed you haven't read it yet.
Love that conversation with Gary Myers. A lot of different stuff in there. By the way, as you're watching the games today and hopefully listening to me, if you're feeling good about your picks but not sure what to eat, make it easy on yourself. Order in on DoorDash. Now you can root for your squad while your food and drinks are on the way. Burgers, chips, dips, soda, pizza, wings, so much more delivered straight to your door. And how about HubSpot? We're going in the fourth quarter right now. It's where games are won, champions are made. In business, it's where sales teams become legends. That's why HubSpot built Sales Hub. To give sales reps the deal-making tools they need to win their Q4, Sales Hub's prospecting workspace organizes your schedule, goal, and to-do list in one place to save your team precious fourth quarter time. And Smart Sequences help sales reps close deals faster than ever. So get ready to dominate Q4 with Sales Hub. Learn more at HubSpot.com/sales. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Make sure to also check out Even Money, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network on Samsung TV Plus, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
Shout out myfrontpagestory.com. All right, now today it's probably too late. I mean, like if you still haven't gotten anything for them today, actually, you know what? You could order it right now, print it out, and just give them the printed out. That's what I'm doing with one of my wife's gifts today. Print it out, give it to them, and say, hey, the story is in the works. Maybe that's a better way to do it. myfrontpagestory.com. Backoffisschedule.com, steakhousesports.com, humanheadnyc.com, Sporticulture, and Pizza Boy Brewing.